Welcome back to episode 2 of Seat at the Table podcast. Woo! Yeah, we did it. Today we're going to be having Nathan Evans kind of talk about Gen Alpha and what does that look like of equipping parents with the right resources and just not only helping disciples them like in the youth group, but also like just in life in general. So Nathan, you want to take it away?
Yeah, let's do this. This is going to be fun. I think this is an interesting one because we're all around this table.
Yeah.
Gen Z, probably going into ministry of some capacity, whether that's in the church, a business, whatever that looks like, right? But Gen Alpha is the first generation younger than us that we get to really disciple. No longer is it us being the young generation, but it's now one beneath us that's being raised up. And it's interesting, like how do we adapt to how culture's changed since we were young and we feel close to their age, but now it's different, right? And I felt like Gen Z, us, was like this bridge generation of technology, but Gen Alpha really feels like the first one that is like a full native to the digital world. Like they were born into technology. And I feel like that's something that is a really cool tool, but something that we know we have to adjust. And I think it's constantly this like adjusting nature of these next generations of how do we adjust to what they were born into and now help them kind of reach that and unlock that. But I think what that means is there's a whole new tools in the toolbox now that we get to use in ministry and discipleship.
Yeah.
Cool. I think the one thing though I'm challenged by is Gen Alpha, whether that's the youngins, kids, youth, whatever that looks like, right? We only really get them in a church or a typical church discipleship model maybe 2 hours a week, right? The rest of the week is up to the parents and to the families. And I think that, I know Hunter talked last episode about isolation, and that's something I think because of the digital world, you're sometimes seeing even more in Gen Alpha. And I think the biggest way that we can combat that is through these intergenerational relationships. It's not Gen Alpha versus Gen Z versus Millennial versus Gen X, but it's, hey, how do we interweave all of this into our discipleship within a church? Of having these generations coexist together, teach each other, and wisdom being poured into each other. So I think for us as a church, the best way we can equip and disciple Gen Alpha is by empowering parents and realizing that the parents of these students that may be in our youth group or kids ministry or in our church, they're the ones that are having much more of a greater impact because they're around these kids who Gen Alpha much more than we are. So I don't know what that looks like. Maybe that's parent workshops, whether that's maybe equipping them with resources and ways to handle the things of life and more than just Bible content, but how do we help these parents know how do they raise their children? How do they handle conflict? How do they discipline? How do they do all these different things? And I think that's one way that we can really fill in and kind of be a resource to these parents. And while we are discipling the parents and the families themselves, we're also discipling the kids in Gen Alpha. So I don't know what y'all's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's so important. It's so good when it comes to like Gen Alpha and what it looks like for youth. I think as a youth pastor or going into kids ministry, what that looks like is also being their parents' pastor. You have to be their biggest advocate. You have to be a shoulder to lean on because we do get them 2 hours a week. However, we need to be able to empower and resource our parents and show them what that looks like to have a healthy community within the home, a healthy leadership, because realistically, they can say we're their pastors all day long, but the truth is they are the pastors of their home. They're the ones leading their home. They're the ones leading their family. So ultimately, I think the parents are who we really have to focus on.
Yeah.
Seth, I think that's so good. Especially you have such great insight on this being a youth pastor right now. And definitely, if we want to reach these kids, we need to empower their parents. But I think the problem with that is a lot of parents don't realize their responsibility in discipling their own children. I think that a lot of parents believe like, oh, it's the responsibility of the church and the pastors to do that. I'm just going to drop them off on church on a Sunday and I'll let the pastors handle that. And so I don't think a lot of parents realize, hey, no, discipleship is 24/7 in and out of your house. And so I think especially, as a youth pastor, pastoring with parents, and even like us who are going into older generation pastoring, such as myself, that we need to emphasize and remind parents, hey, it's not just our job, it's all of our jobs. And I think a verse that came to mind when I was thinking about this was Deuteronomy 6:6-7, which says, "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts, and press them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up." And that, as pastors, we got to remind the parents about, the God-given commandment of parents to disciple and build up their own children in and out of the house. That it's not just our job, it's their job as well.
Yeah, I think something going along that, I think community is also a factor. It's like how do we equip like parents and families to be in community together so they see the examples of discipleship. You know, it's like also like how do we model the way? You know, it's like how does parents model the way for their kids? We have a professor that came and spoke into our class a few weeks ago talking about like, hey, the biggest way that you are going to lead and show the example as like a future pastor is how you model the way, like in the vision that you have. So it's like how do we equip the parents to have that same modeling of life, of saying, getting into their word, of showing what it looks like to follow Jesus throughout their day-to-day life. How do we give the right resources to equip the parents, the adults in the congregation, in our church bodies, in our church communities to also give to Gen Alpha and the future like younger generations?
Yeah, I think this is all great. I think this emphasis on the family dynamic is important because this really is what we're trying to build with the church. Like the church is a family, and that starts with the individual families that are within that. I think one thing I might challenge is the fact that I feel like for me growing up, I always heard it was like kids church, youth group, and big church, and all like these very separate things. I would challenge and think about what it would look like if we really focused on teaching kids, youth, and adults that this is one collective body of Christ, one collective church. And I feel like we believe that, but sometimes don't teach that or emphasize that. I think what happens is you would see Gen Alpha would see their parents, and these parents would see their kids, and see it as a collective unit of a family that's working together to be discipled and to grow in their faith. And I think that can be something pretty powerful.
Yeah, that's so good. Even looking at what are some practical ways we can even do this outside. I think obviously we're never gonna have, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but in more recent years there still is the kids church and then big church. But I think one way we can really bridge this gap is, yes, having our separate ministries where we're able to minister to parents, having that separate ministry where we're able to minister to students, or a separate ministry able to minister to kids. But I think, man, one way that I think we're winning is at my church we do these things called TGIF, Thank God It's Family. And on those nights, it's a big service for families. It reaches all age groups. It's a message that can reach all the way up and reach all the way down. And it's a storytelling service of, man, how can parents be more faithful and love their children in those aspects. And then it also teaches kids the faithfulness of God and how they can feel loved from God. And then we also do separate breakout sessions where parents get these resources and have breakout sessions with our pastors and things, and then our students will have a breakout and our kids will have a breakout. So that's so good, and it's so important now.
I think that's a great example of kind of one of those ways that we can start that is how do we teach families that we can do this together and walk together. And I think that's the best way that Gen Alpha is going to be impacted. And I know that was the topic of this episode, right? Is Gen Alpha. I think that's the best way is we can really just teach this family dynamic. With all being said, I really think the best way we can teach Gen Alpha and help disciple them about the Lord and ways to grow, I think is through intergenerational relationships. And the fact that we have to make sure that Gen Alpha is being able to be poured into and discipled by these other generations. And I think with the surgence of the digital world, right, where Gen Alpha is getting their discipleship from other Gen Alpha aged kids on Instagram or TikTok, whatever it looks like, right? And a lot of times your feed and your digital kind of world is going to be a lot of your age and your generation. And I think the church is a place where you can find more of a mesh of that between different generations that I think can really be helpful. And that's where that family aspect comes in. I think that can really reshape how we do discipleship for on the younger Gen Alpha level.
Yeah, well, that kind of concludes our thoughts on like what does it look like to partner alongside like parents with Gen Alpha as youth ministers, like people who are going into ministry, probably going to be in the younger generations if you're graduating college soon like us, maybe different if you're in different areas of ministry. But yeah, that was episode 2. Like, subscribe, help us out with our project.
yeah.
No, we need to
gotta
get
pay
an
tuition
A,
now.
we gotta pay tuition, we gotta graduate, 16 days for us. So that's crazy. But yeah, see you guys next time.
See ya.